So tonight, this is obviously Invasive Species Awareness Month. And so we've been giving a series of talks at Hanauma Bay concerning what's mostly been going on with aquatic invasive species, because the majority of people know a lot of things about what's going on with terrestrial alien species within Hawaii, but the issue of marine alien species tends to be a little more esoteric to everyone because it doesn't make the news as much as the terrestrial stuff. I've been involved in working with marine alien species since the late 90s here in Hawaii. I started out my career working in what's called the Marine Bioinvasions Lab at the Smithsonian Institution on the East Coast, and came out here as a biologist for Bishop Museum. For 8 years, I was invertebrate collections manager and a marine biologist at Bishop for about 8 years. And that's when I started doing most of my marine alien species work, which is focused on the transport of marine alien species and how to control alien species. So I'll be giving you an overview of essentially a lot of the projects that I've worked on since about 1998 and some of the other projects that I've sort of collaborated on. So the topics I'll be talking about tonight will be the main Hawaiian Islands ballast water study that I conducted from 1998 to 2000. The main Hawaiian Islands vessel biofouling study that I conducted for the Hawaii Coral Reef Initiative from 2000 to 2004. And the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Risk Assessment Study in 2006, and the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Marine Debris Transport Study in 2000, and another one in 2007. And the main Hawaiian Islands and Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Marine Alien Inventory, which is a multi-collaboration with tons of partners at other museums and within Hawaii and various state and federal agencies. And the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Biosecurity Development Implementation that I did starting in 2009 when I worked for NOAA at the Sanctuaries Division. And the main Hawaiian Islands and Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Japan Tsunami Marine Debris Response that I was involved in 2011 to 2013. So I usually begin with terminology when it comes to alien species. You'll see a variety of different terms when it comes to alien species. You'll see the word introduced, you'll see alien, you'll see exotic, you'll see non-indigenous, and they all mean the same thing, a non-native species that occurs in a region where it previously did not exist, at least historically. But there's this other word that we use in science. We like to use these fancy $3 words in science, and this is one of them. It's called cryptogenic. Essentially, it means a species of uncertain origin that is neither demonstrably native or introduced. Most of the time when we say something is cryptogenic, we pretty much know that it's an alien species, but we have no idea what where its historical native range is. And that's because we don't have records for it, because it's been established in somewhere for like 100 years or more, and we never knew where it was native in the first place. So instead of us saying we don't know, we just say cryptogenic instead. But there's also the term invasive. So that's what we're talking about, invasive species. And sometimes they're interchangeable with alien, but sometimes not. The word invasive is an ecological term that means an alien or native species, which I'll expand on in a moment, that actively does or is likely to cause economic, environmental harm or harm to human health. So an invasive species can be either an alien or a native. So we all know about invasive species like sponges and other things that you hear about in the news that are in Kaneohe Bay. But a perfect example of a native species acting invasively is there was an algae in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands at both Curie Atoll and Pearl and Hermes Atoll. It doesn't have a common name. It's a green algae, and it's called Buddleia composita. It's a native species, and for some reason, it's some change in the nutrient cycling or whatever in these lagoons, this species bloomed up and killed a huge amount of coral in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And people thought of it more as an alien species, but it was actually a native species that was acting invasively. So you can use the word invasive to mean basically when something either native or alien has started taking over or impacting or causing phase shifts within nature. So I just wanted to clarify a lot of those things before. So what I work on mostly is how stuff gets transported to new areas. And I sort of operate on this sort of theory of biological islands. And I talk about biological islands when I refer to maritime vessels, both commercial and private. And the ways that these commercial vessels and private vessels can transport things are a variety of ways that are associated with their normal operations. So with commercial vessels, we have ballast water. Ballast water is salt water that's pulled into dedicated tanks on ships to basically adjust the trim and the way the ships are acting in the open ocean, or if their cargo is imbalanced or whatever. So it's required on a lot of ships that they have to carry ballast water for like safe operations. But this ballast water can basically transport plankton, like on the top left up here. That's a plankton larvae of a sea squirt, which turns into what it's like to the right there. And so, and there are also adult stages like fish and other things can be transported in ballast water, but also resting stages, as we call things, like some algae will get into ballast tanks and go into what's called a resting stage, and they settle to the bottom, and then they'll wait till they get introduced in somewhere and then pop back up again and be, active. There's also sediments. The middle photo that you see is actually a giant anchor fluke that's covered in sediment. It was transported in a dry dock that was brought here many years ago, and I was digging through it, and it was basically had been out of the water for almost 10 days, but there was enough salt spray as it transported to keep all the stuff that was living in the sediment alive. There were worms, there were clams, there were all sorts of things still living in this, but this is an extreme case of sediments. A lot of the sediments are in the bottom of the ballast tanks, and they get stirred up, and there's stuff that's living in them that gets introduced that way. And so there's also biofouling. That's one of the research things that we started in Hawaii that was sort of like the first place in the United States that we started looking at the biofouling that forms on the bottom of ships and also in like debris and those sort of things. So biofouling is like these barnacles and hydroids and like seaweeds that form on these things and get transported as adult stages. And those adult stages can actually leave their larvae behind when they get transported. So with private vessels, you mostly just have biofouling. A lot of private vessels don't operate with ballast water systems. So mostly we're looking at biofouling associated with these private vessels. But we also have looked at marine debris as a transport mechanism. So marine debris is a big issue in Hawaii. And so it's been a big issue for us to look at from the standpoint of its impact from like abrasion on coral reefs, but also introducing marine alien species. So the first study I conducted in Hawaii in 1998 was called the South Oahu Marine Invasion Shipping Study. The goal of it was to broadly survey the maritime shipping industry in Hawaii through a collection of biological and operational data that relate to the issue of marine alien introductions. And so we're talking biological data, we're talking about the organisms that are living in the ballast tanks, and we're talking operational data. I was looking at what types of vessels were arriving, how often they were arriving, what kind of operations they were doing here. Were they discharging ballast? Were they taking on ballast? So a lot of operational data that did not exist for Hawaii at that time. Much of this data was being produced in a lot of the ports around the country, because that's what I was working on before I came here. I was working on East Coast port dynamics and ballast water introductions. And I specifically looked at ballast water and sediments in 74 vessels, and I also conducted a pilot study with 8 vessels looking at biofouling communities, which was one of the first studies that was done in the United States, and now it's like a big thing in the United States now. The majority of the ballast water that was being discharged was minimal, but the level of biofouling transport I determined during the study was actually one of the most important vectors compared to ballast water. The reason ballast water is not a very important vector in Hawaii in some cases is that basically ships carry ballast water because they're either empty of cargo and coming to pick up cargo, or they're trying to balance out their other loads. So Hawaii is a net importer of goods. So ships are coming in full of goods and those sort of things, and they carry very little ballast water because they don't need to. So what they're doing mostly is exporting our ballast water because they're picking up stuff here and having to balance out their loads. So compared to other ports in the country that are importing or exporting coal and grain and gypsum and those sort of things, we don't export a lot of things here, and so we don't import a lot of ballast water. But biofouling has turned out to be a really important vector. So with that, I convinced the Hawaii Coral Reef Initiative to fund me from 2003 to 2004 to look at biofouling as a transport mechanism. So I looked at a total of 35 vessels and yielded a lot of species. 48 was identified as aquatic invasives and 12 as like a cryptogenic forms. And a lot of them were species that were already here or new species that were being brought in. And also within the Hawaii Coral Reef Initiative project, I formed a working group with the state of Hawaii to determine sort of the major criteria and the potential alternatives for management for biofouling. And it produced sort of initial framework for management of hull fouling through a series of proactive, reactive and post-event measures. And so it sort of started off the process that's now, you will hear next week, my colleague Jules Kuo, who is working on policy issues concerning biofouling and for ballast water. And so it's basically a lot of this early stuff is now what's leading to our administrative rules and things that are being worked on now. So from the components of this biofouling study, I basically looked at that mostly the things that are most important from biofouling are things that are like stochastic arrivals, which means random. So it's basically not the predictable arrivals that are coming in like the Matson ships and the regular barges and those sort of thing. It's basically the oddball things that are being brought in. So during the study, there were like things like towed vessel platforms like barges and other oddball things that were not part of the normal arrival schedules. Derelict vessels that are, we get a lot of derelict vessels here, the vessels that have been like had mechanical problems out in the open ocean, have been floating around for months, and somebody salvages them and they bring them here. And we get a lot of decommissioned military vessels, which have a huge amounts of biofouling on them, and also personal craft, which a lot of them, there's no predictable arrivals schedules for a lot of the personal craft. So we don't know where a lot of the stuff's coming from until it actually gets here. And from the predictable side, the high-risk things are the towed vessel platforms that we do get that are predictable, that are coming from like the West Coast and other parts of the Pacific. So in 2000, I conducted a brief marine debris study in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And all my marine debris studies for marine aliens have all been in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And so from that study and from another one that was done, which was a more concerted effort in 2007, 2008, the surveys of derelict fishing gear was what we mostly focused on, because that's the big thing that we try to remove from the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, because it's an entanglement hazard for protected species. So from fishing gear that was at French Frigate Shoals, Pearl and Hermes, Curie Atoll, and Midway, basically I found one new record of a marine alien. So only one new record of something that came from outside of Hawaii that was being brought by marine debris. The other records of stuff that were on the marine debris were things that are established in the main Hawaiian Islands that were being transported to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands by this debris. So basically you've got along the archipelago types of transport and sort of minimal transport from outside. Because you have to think these nets, a lot of these nets are basically lost or dumped in the middle of the open ocean, and they're not near shorelines where they can get marine alien species on them a lot of times. And so unless these nets are drifting near other shorelines around the Pacific, they're generally not going to pick up stuff, but they do transport things within the archipelago pretty readily. Next, I conducted a risk assessment in 2006 in collaboration with the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries with NOAA and Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. And so this was in the beginning when the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands monument was being created, Papahanaumokuakea. And basically they were wanting me to assess the risk of exposure to marine alien species and what were going to be the big risks. And I determined that vessel biofouling associated with research vessels and the resupply activities for the field camps in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands were deemed the greatest risk. And the main Hawaiian Islands was the main source, because with the way the activities are, everything that goes to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands comes into the main Hawaiian Islands first. They don't go direct to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands because it's such a long journey. Generally, most vessels have to come into the mains and refuel and regroup and do whatever they have to do before they go to the Northwest. And so that's where we determined that basically we needed to focus our efforts on prevention, looking at our research vessels that are going up there and the resupply vessels for all our activities, because the fishing ground were like closed at this time. And so basically all the activity was us. It was scientists and the conservation activities. And so we needed to like self-police ourselves at this point. Another project that I've worked on since I began here was the marine alien inventory for the main Hawaiian Islands and the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And this requires a lot of types of data collection methods. Basically at the top are examples of like research publications, going through historical research publications. You see a diver on the far right doing like surveys, because we do yearly reef assessment and monitoring trips up there. And during those trips, I was on many of them. I was always looking for marine alien species records along with the normal coral and other stuff that we were like looking at. In the middle, we have some settlement plates that we were using in conjunction with our partners in NOAA Fisheries. they were using these for like biodiversity type studies, but I was coming along on the trips to look at the organisms that on there had documented many alien species on these that you would normally not see because they're, you know, these are huge areas. I mean, Pearl and Hermes Atoll alone, you could fit Kaneohe Bay in the lagoon of that place. And so it's a big place and it's really hard to survey. And also, all my years of museum work, I spent a lot of time going through museum collections at the Smithsonian. And here, you'll see down on the bottom right there, that's what that is. It's all these museum collections that are historical collections that these organisms may have not been considered alien when they were first collected because nobody knew. But then when you go back and re-examine and look at historical records combined with that, along with the reef assessment and monitoring trips, you start getting a picture of what the inventory is for the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and the main Hawaiian Islands. And this is still ongoing at all times, but we're starting to tie up some of the loose ends on this. And this is sort of what we've got so far. For the main Hawaiian Islands, you know, there's roughly 332 alien species and 141 cryptogenic. So essentially you've got over 400 species that are either considered alien or more than likely are alien. In the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, before I started my study in 2007, basically there were only considered to be 2 fish species, 3 invertebrate species, and 1 algae species introduced up there. And now we're up to 42 just marine invertebrates and algae, and 15 cryptogenic species. So we're basically over 50 up there, and that's not new introductions. These are just, it's just a what we call sampling effort. So actually looking at these places and actually determining, because there were no studies that were done prior to this that were looking at alien species up there. And so we're actually in pretty good shape in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands as it exists from the standpoint of compared to what's happening in the main Hawaiian Islands. And basically the species run the full gambit of what you see here on the left. You know, there's fish, there's like, you know, tube worms, there's sea squirts, there's little crustaceans, there's sponges, algae, there's even an introduced seagrass at Midway. And so there's just everything, there's a full gamut from fish to plants that you'll find in the main Hawaiian Islands and the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So I began working for NOAA Sanctuaries in 2009, and I was asked to develop a marine biosecurity program for the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which was based on my earlier risk assessment that I did for the activities. And so basically I based the biosecurity program on what's essentially the ecological process of an invasion. So you basically have an invasion, you have an introduction, you have an establishment period, and then you have a growth and spread period. So I basically put different aspects of that program tied under these different ecological steps. And from the risk assessment, it was determined that really you need to put your efforts into prevention, because when things get introduced on land, a lot of times you can put a lot of efforts into some place and get like an introduced grass eradicated. You get something introduced in the ocean, you're never going to get rid of it. There's been no successful eradications of marine organisms that have been introduced in the ocean ever in the history of invasions. So basically your efforts need to go into prevention and not into like trying to like respond to things. So basically within the prevention side, there was a permit system developed for the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. And within that permitting system, I established a vessel inspection program and best management practices. And so basically all vessels, whoever they were associated with NOAA, with whoever, all were required to have a vessel inspection for their ballast water and their hulls. And if they didn't pass that inspection, they had to do some sort of remediation to fix that, or they weren't going to get their permit. And so they would have to do measures to like fix anything that was wrong before they could get their permit. And we also developed best management practices for activities within the northwestern Hawaiian Islands to not spread things that were already established there. And within the establishment part of the program is part of that inventory I was telling you about. So basically we're looking at, documenting existing new records, looking at docks and seawalls and shallow water nearshore areas, and using the reef assessment and monitoring program data, and what we call ARMS, which are the autonomous reef monitoring structures, were the settlement plates that we used to find some new records and new distributional patterns for marine alien species in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And for monitoring and control of stuff that's already there, we developed a disinfection program for all of our gear. So before you can even dive in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, your gear all has to be put in a 5% bleach solution. and then dried. And so we do that before we even leave the dock. We start doing those disinfection programs for gear, scientific apparatus, and all those sort of things, and the boats that are associated with the ship before we even dive in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And we're basically using our activities up there to monitor the spread of established species that are up there. So the next project that I worked on wholeheartedly was when the 2011 Japan tsunami happened. And there were big concerns about when debris started showing up here, whether there were going to be alien species associated with it. And so I worked really closely with the state of Hawaii and the NOAA Marine Debris Program to develop a response plan for this debris. So I basically developed a field guide for state and federal workers that were responding to debris. And we got a lot of different types of debris. Like on this top left up here, this is a big metal structure that was probably part of like a buoy system in a harbor somewhere in Japan. It was covered in basically up in the far right, three of these species that were common on it. The one on the very top is a type of opihi that's native to Japan. And so there was pretty much a lot of those on this thing. The blue mussels you see in the middle and these other alien clams that were associated with it. So, and we got a lot of boats, like the one you see in the middle. This is a boat that washed up in Midway, and we're basically, it was pulled up higher on the shore, so any of the organisms that were associated with it would just die and dry out because we couldn't really move the boats because they were so big and heavy. And there were also these big concerns about radiation with the debris that was coming into Japan, even though the Fukushima power plant meltdown happened 5 days after the tsunami, but there were still concerns by the government and public groups and the state that there might be radiation associated with the debris. So I had to get trained as a radiation safety officer and carry one of these meters around with me and go check out debris all the time with the state and with the Fish and Wildlife Service at Midway to determine, to see if there was any radiation, and there never was any. So that's what I did for the tsunami response, was develop guidebooks and also come out to the responses and collect organisms. And they were sent to a clearinghouse in the mainland where they compiled all these species that were associated with marine debris for the west coast of the United States and Hawaii. So a lot of products have been produced from all this, and if you ever have a dull night and you really want to get some sleep, you can grab some of these reports and read them online or otherwise. But basically, for the South Oahu Marine Invasion Shipping Study report was produced in 2001, and then the whole fouling study was produced in 2004. All the marine debris studies came out in a paper in 2008, and you see all these variety of other things that were produced. So there have been documents and reports and everything that have put all this stuff out there. And the inventory, I'm just finishing up for the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's in prep right now with my colleague Holly Bullock at Bishop Museum. And that's going to be a sanctuaries document that will pretty much be open to the public to see when it eventually gets published. So I didn't do any of this by myself. I did it under partnerships with all of my colleagues at NOAA within the state of Hawaii. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Coast Guard was integral in a lot of the stuff that I was doing, and funding from the Hawaii Coral Reef Initiative for the biofouling study, which was one of the first ones done in the United States. And now it's pretty much a standard study that's being done on the West Coast, and they're actually developing administrative rules in California and other states looking at biofouling now. And so we led the charge with doing biofouling studies now, and now everybody realizes it's a super important vector that everybody needs to focus on now. So basically all these groups and hundreds of my colleagues basically allowed me to conduct all this work and be successful in documenting all these things. So that's what I have for this evening, and if you guys have any questions, feel free. Here.
Your entire focus on the vector, getting it from there to here. And those same vectors in a lesser scale or more, depending, have been happening for thousands of years. Isn't it true that the problems we have with vectors is that we've changed the chemistry of the shoreline so much that they're taking over, whereas before they were just a little nuisance?
As far as the vectors existing for 1,000 years, the vectors before were essentially wooden vessels. And so you basically had ballast, but it was dry ballast. And that was responsible for introducing a lot of things, but a lot of the stuff was introduced hundreds of years ago by stuff associated with wooden vessels. But we've got ships that are carrying basically millions of gallons of salt water that's pumped in from a shoreline area that's not even associated with Hawaii, that water gets dumped in places, and that has been a huge vector. The vessels are faster now. They can go from like point A to point B within 5 to 6 days, and stuff can survive a lot better. And there's a lot more of them than in the old days. And so, what we've done to our shorelines as far as like stressing them out, that doesn't help. Like, so you bring that up, and that is a valid point, that basically the stresses that we're providing from like runoff and our impacts on reefs and other shoreline areas doesn't help, because stressed out systems can't protect themselves from like these alien species a lot of times. So there is a difference in the way the shipping patterns are and the way things are being brought. So it's basically what we refer to in science as propagule pressure. So you're basically getting exposed a lot more often with fresher propagules that are like that'll more easily take hold than it was in the old days when you had like vessels that were like, with dry ballast that were taking 20 days to come across to like Hawaii. So it's a little bit different. That make sense?
It is a little different, but the length of time that it had that these vectors were operating on a smaller scale adds up to one nasty boat company.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a chance to grow. They'd be part of the natural environment. Consider them invasive.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have things that we do, putting the fertilizer out and to make these things grow where they wouldn't grow before.
Yeah, I agree. So we do our stresses that we provide to the environment.
The way of fighting some of these things is finding another invasive species that might kill off this.
No, we can't. We don't really do that in the marine environment. Yeah, happens on land.
We protect our crops on land by bringing in the right kind of wasp with everything to kill off whatever's hurting us.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've ever done that in the ocean.
No, that's not really a valid thing to do in the ocean most of the time. So you have so little control over what goes on in that different dimension you have in an ocean setting as opposed to a terrestrial setting. So it's like basically.
I think our experiments in the ocean were haphazard, and some just didn't work, and some made nastier problems. But if we put the same intensity into research to solve those problems, biological weapons might have a better chance of doing it.
Yeah.
But we don't use the resources that way.
Yeah. Can I have another question in the back? Yep, go ahead.
Is it feasible to put something on all these ships that would neutralize or clean up the water before you put it in or take it out, so we don't have that exchange?
Yeah, so basically, since a lot of this has been going on with ballast water, there has been ballast water treatment systems that have been developed that are basically filtration, ultraviolet light, and those sort of things. And the main thing that's done to manage ballast water now is basically doing open ocean exchanges. So vessels in a lot of ports, especially on the West Coast, are required to show within their ballasting records that they basically, after they've left, that after they've gotten off a certain amount of distance offshore, they start running saltwater through open ocean saltwater through these ballast systems, and they flush out everything that came from the coastal side. And basically, they're one of my colleagues, Jules Kuo, who you'll be listening to next week. She's working on this instrumentation system that was developed that basically can identify. By just basically taking a small sample of the ballast water, it can identify whether it actually has viable organisms in it by just slipping it into this little unit you hold in your hand, and it can tell you pass or fail on the ballast water. And so most of the states don't have the capacity to basically look at every single vessel that comes in, so they do random checks on ballast water. But most of the ships now are starting to do exchanges or have ballast water treatment systems built in. Matson took the lead here in Hawaii by being the first carrier here when one of their new ships they built, it had a ballast water treatment system built into it when they first built it. So a lot of the industry, it's moved into the realm from the science to the engineers now. So we know stuff comes in, so now who is going to try to fix that? It's not going to be me as a marine biologist, it's going to be the maritime engineers and the maritime industry, because there are rules and regulations now about discharging in a lot of ports on the West Coast and the East Coast.
So if you were king, and I don't mean it as a joke,
yeah,
what would you mandate to, and I think the real key is prevention, is what I heard. Right?
Yeah.
What would you mandate?
For which?
To stop the prevention of alien species introduction.
Are
there 4 or 5 things that are really critical, or?
That's the things that we have been working on as far as administrative rules in Hawaii is the ballast water has sort of become more in place than the other. And right now we're working on basically surveys and rules for the biofouling issues. A lot of the other states on the West Coast are way ahead of us on this because when they started realizing that biofouling was a huge issue, ballast water has been regulated for quite a while now. There's required reporting in all U.S. ports. All ships are required to send in a ballast water reporting form that's basically compiled at this data gathering place at the Smithsonian Institution, and it's also collected at the state level. So those reports are coming in. So basically, you can identify a vessel that looks like it hadn't done its its due diligence for like ballast water exchange, and you can go do surveys on it. But there's no teeth associated with it as far as fines and that sort of stuff. What it has to move into is realizing that there's going to be fines. So with the biofouling, right now it's basically surveying what ships do in general. Biofouling is not a great thing for most ships because it makes them lose time, fuel, and all that. So they basically are on these maintenance cycles that are requiring them to clean, pretty heavily about every 5 years and do spot cleanings. But the issue is like where you're cleaning it at. They can't pull into here and start cleaning because then they're going to just introduce stuff. So basically administrative rules at California and in Washington State are starting to come into play, sort of working on this issue right now. So like you said, if I was king, basically we would have these administrative rules in place that have some sort of penalties associated, but you're getting into a slippery slope when you start doing penalties on commercial shipping industry because you're going to make your gas cost more, you're going to make your food cost more, and all that other stuff, because all those costs that go to the commercial shipping industry for doing remediation gets passed on to us. And so it's a case of everybody accepting that if we're going to try to protect our environment, it's going to cost us. It's going to cost us money. It always will. I mean, the commercial industry is not going to take the hit on this. And we've had a lot of threats from them that they would just say, well, we just stop coming to Hawaii then if you're going to have stiff regulations. In the early days, when I was in the late 1990s, they were talking about, well, if you guys impose all these regulations on ballast water stuff, we'll just close down. Don't come to Hawaii anymore. Have fun without us. And that was kind of the attitude. But now that's kind of changed. And a lot of the companies are trying to be a little more environmental stewards and realizing that looks better to the public than them saying, who cares, whatever. So
okay. I think the problem fits good in your head.
Yeah. Anybody else? Come somebody in the back here.
So why is there species like because of people releasing the ballast water?
So invasive species that you're getting, they're coastal species anyway, and their larvae are being produced in the water by coastal species. I mean, there's not much in the way of there's no alien species out that live in the open ocean. All this debris that comes in, everybody freaks out because it's got these gooseneck barnacles on it and all these other crazy looking things. But those things are just natural species that live in the open ocean. They're not alien to anywhere. They're considered cosmopolitan. They're basically found throughout the world. They're just more of them now because we're throwing so many plastic things in the water for them to attach to. They attach to the plastics just as much as they would to the logs that they used to attach to before plastics existed. So you see a lot more of it. And when stuff buoys and big plastic floats wash in, they're covered with these crabs and these other things that are actually not alien. They're just pelagic species that just get washed up on the shore and they don't make it. They can't live not in a pelagic environment. They don't survive on the shore at all. So they're basically have evolved to live in the open ocean, which is amazing to me because there's not much food out there, but they managed to make it anyway. So that's the reason, that's the theory behind getting so many hundreds of miles offshore and using that water to exchange out the coastal water that's there, and it just basically flushes everything out. So go ahead.
Which difficulty is in working with foreign flag vessels?
That is a difficulty, but there are regulations from the standpoint of the International Maritime Organization that has jumped on the the bandwagon about ballast water about 10 years ago. And so the issue of ballast water introductions is in the mind of the International Maritime Organization, which polices all vessels, not just foreign vessels, everybody's vessels. And so, and those vessels are also required to submit reporting forms when they come in. And so, and if they don't, the Coast Guard actually does safety inspections on them a lot of times. So a lot of the foreign vessels end up getting safety inspections most of the time anyway, because they're foreign vessels. But yeah, most of the foreign vessels toe the line when it comes to that, because they're following international laws, not our laws. And there's some differences between them, but there are rules and regulations for them.